Joining me now is Senator Alex Padilla. He's the Democrat from California. Let's start with some of the picks President-elect Trump has announced this week, Senator. We had breaking news in the past hour that Trump intends to name fossil fuel executive Chris Wright as his energy secretary. Wright has been an outspoken supporter of oil and gas drilling, including fracking. This comes as some of Trump's other choices face serious questions about their qualifications and their fitness, including Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, Fox News host Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at Health and Human Services. The incoming Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, has said all options are on the table to get Trump the team he wants as quickly as possible, including perhaps recess appointments that would sidestep the confirmation process. What are Democrats prepared to do in response?
Well, good to be back with you, Reverend. What are Democrats prepared to do in response? Whatever it takes, not just to uphold the Constitution of the United States, but the interest of the people here. Donald Trump is way beyond making a mockery of what an incoming president should be doing, regardless of who's in the majority of Congress. It's one thing to have policy disagreements, but the examples that you laid out, whether it's Tulsi Gabbard having privy to the most sensitive intelligence information when she has sided with the leaders of Syria and Russia and others, is undermining our national security. The selection of Matt Gaetz, are you kidding me, as a potential Attorney General of the United States? You make reference to this ethics report. That's just the beginning of it. This is not a guy who's gotten in trouble for stealing bubblegum, right? The accusations against him, the witnesses and evidence against him has to do with sex trafficking of minors, among other things. So these are people who are far from being qualified to be in the position that Donald Trump wants.
Let me stop you right there, because you're on Judiciary Committee. On the topic of Trump's pick for Attorney General, NBC is reporting tonight that a majority of Senate Republicans doubt Matt Gaetz will be confirmed as Attorney General, according to sources. Yesterday, House Speaker Mike Johnson asked that the House Ethics Committee not release its report on Matt Gaetz's conduct while in Congress. He also said he'd block the Senate Judiciary, on which you sit, from viewing the report's investigation of allegations of misconduct on Gaetz's part, including the possible sex trafficking of a minor that you referred to. A federal investigation brought no charges against Gaetz, who has denied all wrongdoing. Still, he has resigned just before the report was slated to be released. Senator, if there's nothing damaging in the report, why won't they let it out? And what can the Senate do to get their hands on it?
Well, that's what I've been saying now for days. What are they afraid of? Whether it's by not releasing the report, which is relevant if we're going to consider this nomination, or B, we hear that President-elect Trump is going around the traditional FBI background check and vetting for his nominees, with the Senate is going to consider them. So I think there's two things at play here. Number one, we need to get not just the report that was on the verge of being released, but any supporting evidence, documentation, and I think we'd be more than happy to hear from witnesses that were part of that process. But at the same time, we cannot let Senate Republicans off the hook. This is a major test of them. Are they loyal to Donald Trump, or are they loyal to the Constitution and their oath of office? I've seen the reports, too, that there's many Republicans who don't think Gaetz will be confirmed. I need to hear that in public, because to say it behind closed doors, off the record, is one thing, but the big test will be when these unqualified nominees are before us. Are they willing to stand up to Trump and vote no?
Now, staying with Gaetz, the former Florida congressman has long been associated with efforts to change to rewrite history about January 6th, pushing unfounded claims about federal agitators in the crowd. He has also taken up the case of January 6th defendants who claim they've been mistreated, including those held in the D.C. jail. According to Just Security, nearly all of these inmates have been charged with assaulting law enforcement officers. President Trump has spoken about pardoning these prisoners, even calling them hostages. What kind of signal would that send to the American people?
Again, for a party that claims to be the party of law enforcement and respect for the rule of law, they're doing anything but. January 6th was not a walk in the park. It was a day where there was a violent, deadly insurrection in our nation's capital, and everybody involved with that violence has to be held to account. The legal system has been working. Many people have been convicted, and they're serving a variety of sentences. So for President Trump to come in and just pardon everybody is an affront and the ultimate disrespect to the women and men in law enforcement that were, serving and sacrificing so much on that very, very dark day in our nation's history.
Now, while we have a little bit of time, Senator, in the lead up to Trump returning to the White House, Democratic lawmakers are doing what they can to protect their states, and that includes you and California Governor Gavin Newsom. What are you going to do, and how are you doing it?
Right. Well, look, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say we know Donald Trump has it in for California, and there's nothing that he would love to do better than scrape back a lot of the federal funds that have come to the state of California and undo the policies that we're trying to lead on, whether it's access to health care, whether it's environmental protection, whether it's protecting a woman's right to choose, or anything else. And so we are working, Governor Newsom and I, with the Biden administration to lock in some of these policy changes, let California continue to lead on providing more health care for more people, what we're doing to clean the air, provide clean water for Californians. And the biggest example is really the disaster relief that we deserve for the wildfires and the floods that have ravaged California in recent years. So we want to pin that money down so Donald Trump can't claw it back while we brace ourselves for 4 years of an antagonistic Trump administration.
All right. Thanks to California Senator Alex Padilla.
I got a question for y'all. Y'all seen J.D. Vance? Where's J.D. Vance?
I know, right?
I've not seen J.D. Vance.
Is Elon Musk the VP?
I think my feeling is Elon Musk is the surrogate VP. He's standing. So let me get this straight. So Elon Musk is on the phone talking to leaders from around the world in Iran and getting on the phone call with Putin. And J.D. Vance is out there trying to find some votes for Matt Gaetz. That's what I was
about to say, the only reporting I have seen on J.D. Vance in the last few days is about those calls that he was making for Matt Gaetz.
It's really crazy. Just so people understand out there at home, during this is a transition, right? So during the transition, it is when the president-elect is putting together the 100-day plan for the government, where the president-elect is picking the cabinet members. And when Joe Biden was the president-elect and Kamala Harris was the vice president-elect, she was in all of those meetings. She was going back and forth to Delaware. We was going up the road every day to Wilmington because that's where the president was, the president-elect. And she was in the room and involved in those conversations. She interviewed potential cabinet secretaries. The president-elect cared about what she had to say. I wonder, does Donald Trump care about what Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has to say?
No, he cares more about what Elon Musk has to say. That's very clear. That's very obvious. And so Elon, the first buddy, has put himself, sandwiched himself in between J.D. Vance and the president. That's the relationship that's going to play out here in Washington to watch, in my view, because you're now having power amassed in a private citizen who is the buddy to the president, not an elected official, who's on critical phone calls with world leaders at the president's request. Now, JD, you need to probably check it, baby, because I think you've been checked.
You got to work your way in there, honey. You can't let Elon Musk box you out, boo-boo.
Got to make it. That's it. Boxed out boo-boo. That's a hard way to go.
Talk about triple B.
Do you think that there comes a point, though, where there is a fissure between Musk and Trump? I mean, he does seem to be spending a lot of time with the man.
Well, this whole, we're gonna create an agency to get rid of agencies is just BS. I mean, it's just crazy. Number one, I
hadn't thought of it that way. Create an agency to get rid of agencies.
I mean, I went to write it down. Actually,
you're creating an agency to get rid of agencies. I mean, how dumb is that?
And put two people in charge just to lay your bureaucracy.
Put two people in charge.
I mean,
two people who are polar opposites in their agendas. Put two people in charge. Of undoing the work of the government. So, folks, all of this is smoke and mirrors crap. It's crazy. It is. If the Congress has any self-respect left, okay, let me. I'll look for it.
Well, if they don't do the recess appointments, maybe they have some,
Well, that's up to Thune. That's up to John Thune, and whether or not he will capitulate or control the situation. You are an independent. You are one of the branches of government, and so you have sovereignty in that regard. But I think in the totality of all of this, there's a lot of noise. Oh, we're going to get rid of this agency and that agency. But no one's press. Could you ask them the question? When you create that hole in this government service space, what are you replacing it with? How are you going to provide for those citizens who rely on those services of government to help them deal with some really profoundly important issues in their lives? So, yeah, create an agency to get rid of an agency. That's...
Don't make no sense.
Government at work.
Donald Trump campaigned on a promise to lower inflation and fix the American economy, an economy that most experts say is right now one of the strongest performing in the world. But much of Trump's economic plan lacks some detail, and one piece of his economic plan for a second term is to impose sweeping tariffs on other countries, particularly China. Trump has favored tariffs as a solution to economic problems for years, even saying on the campaign trail that tariff is, quote, the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Which is weird, but whatever. Bottom line is that tariffs are neither inherently good nor inherently bad. They are a tool which, when used strategically, can remedy trade imbalances, protect certain domestic industries, or influence other countries to improve their trade, wage, or human rights practices. Trump already imposed considerable tariffs during his first term in the White House, and the Biden administration has maintained $360 billion worth of Trump's China tariffs. They've even imposed some of their own. Trump now says that he plans to increase tariffs in his next presidency, floating the idea of a blanket 20% tariff on every U.S. trading partner and up to 60% on most imported goods from China. He's even said in order to keep Chinese electric vehicles from undercutting American electric vehicles, he would impose, quote, whatever tariffs are required, 100%, 200%, 1,000%. China dominates the electric vehicle industry worldwide. In 2023, China was responsible for 58% of the global electric vehicle market. That's 5 times the size of the U.S. market. But these Chinese electric vehicles are not sold here in the United States, in part due to restrictions that Trump imposed in his last presidency and restrictions that were upheld by the Biden administration. One of the most popular Chinese electric vehicles in the world is the sleek BYD Seagull, made by BYD, which stands for Build Your Dreams. It costs approximately $10,000 to buy in China. Now, if that vehicle were imported to the United States with the current tariffs on Chinese EVs at 100%, you'd pay $20,000 for it here in America. And $20,000 would still be cheaper. It'd be $8,000 cheaper than the least expensive electric vehicle made here in America, like the Nissan Leaf or the Chevrolet Bolt. So in order for the U.S. to have a competitive edge with China in the electric vehicle industry, these tariffs could help even the playing field. It's worth noting that there is an American-made electric vehicle company that happens to benefit directly from tariffs like these, and that is, of course, Elon Musk's Tesla. Musk is now part of Donald Trump's incoming administration as co-head of the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which we'll talk about a little later in the show. But here's the downside of tariffs. They almost always, at least in the immediate future, until markets can adjust, make goods more expensive for the consumer. Tariffs are not, in fact, paid for by foreign companies. It's the importers, a.k.a. the American companies, that pay those tariffs, and those companies universally end up passing that tax onto the consumer in the form of higher prices. So in the end, you, the American consumer, end up footing the bill for tariffs, or you just don't buy the product. Here's where things get even more complicated. If you impose tariffs on another country, that country will return the favor. They will impose tariffs on you, and then you can have a trade war. Donald Trump sparked a trade war with China during his last presidency when he slapped a series of tariffs on Chinese imports, and the Chinese government retaliated against U.S. exporters. As a result, U.S. exports, particularly of agricultural goods, dropped significantly. American soybean farmers were hit the hardest since China is the largest buyer of American soybeans in the world. So to help fix this crushing blow, you, the taxpayer, then had to subsidize American soybean farmers to the tune of about $28 billion. So in the end, you paid for the tariffs twice. And I am not here to argue for or against tariffs. That's a conversation for people much smarter than I am. But as I said, sometimes they're a useful and necessary tool, but a policy of this magnitude needs to take into account the whole picture. As economic journalist Bethany McLean writes in an essay for the Washington Post, quote, a targeted tariff that's part of a broader policy code could be the right thing to do, even if there are economic costs. But we need to be humble about what we don't know and think in a nuanced, careful way about exactly what problem we're trying to solve and what the costs could be, which is sage advice. Unfortunately, Donald Trump's policymaking vibe is not one we would generally call humble, nuanced, or careful thinking.
To lots of people, Donald Trump's choice of Matt Gaetz for Attorney General feels like a sick joke, and for good reason. Just to recap, back in 2021, Gaetz was under federal investigation for child sex trafficking, but the Justice Department did not end up charging him. It did prompt the House Ethics Committee to open their own investigation into his alleged sexual misconduct and illicit drug use. And this week, we got a sense of how damaging their findings might be when a lawyer revealed that his client told the Ethics Committee that she actually saw Gaetz have sex with a minor. Now, when it comes to whether the committee makes their findings public, House Speaker Mike Johnson said on Thursday that he is not involved and can't be involved in the decision to release the report on Gaetz. But just a day later, after a quick visit to Mar-a-Lago, the speaker suddenly became very involved.
Do you think the public has a right to know, given that he will be Trump's top attorney?
The rules of the House have always been that a former member is beyond the jurisdiction of the Ethics Committee, and so I don't think that's relevant. I'm going to strongly request the Ethics Committee not issue the report, because that is not the way we do things in the House, and I think that would be a terrible precedent.
So to sum this all up, Trump has named an alleged sex trafficker to carry out the laws of this country as our next attorney general. And the Republican Speaker of the House says the American people have no right to know more about the allegations. According to Speaker Johnson, that kind of transparency, the release of a report, would be a terrible precedent. But as multiple outlets have reported, there is actually ample precedent to do exactly that. Now, joining me now is Andrew Weissmann, the former general counsel at the FBI and a senior member of special counsel Robert Mueller's team. Andrew, it's great to see you. I just want to start. I mean, there's a lot of focus on this report and what it might do. There is ample precedent for the release of this. But if it's released, or if people get access to it in some way, what kind of details have the potential to be in there that are beyond what we already know?
So I think there's sort of two things to focus on. One is what may or may not be in the report. And we simply do not know. And obviously, the public has a right to know that in connection with somebody who would be the Attorney General of the United States. Remember, there's no right to be the Attorney General of the United States any more than there is a right to be President of the United States or to sit on the Supreme Court. So transparency is in order so people have the information. But even if it turns out at the end of the day there is transparency, and let's assume there's nothing there, that there are responses to this, there's reasons that he wasn't charged, there's still the issue of just competence of should this person be in a position which, as the senator-elect said, is such a serious position. So there are really two things to keep one's eye on. One is this potentially explosive and disqualifying event, but there's already something we know, which is, from a competence point of view, this is not somebody who you want sitting in that position.
I think the competence thing is the most important thing, which is why I started the show that way as well. I would want to ask you one more technical thing, because you know the answers to all these technical things. I mean, Gates was under a federal investigation until 2023, and this week there weren't charges filed, but his spokesperson released a statement saying, Merrick Garland's DOJ cleared Matt Gaetz and didn't charge him. And I just want to be clear here. Declining to bring charges is not the same as clearing. So can you just explain that for people who are trying to understand the lingo?
Sure. So there are lots of reasons that you would not bring a criminal case. Now, just to be clear, you could not bring a criminal case because you think the person's actually innocent, in which case it would be clearing. But you can also not bring a case because you think the proof doesn't rise to the level of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It could be clear and convincing evidence, or to be super technical, or a preponderance. There could be substantial evidence, but just not enough for a criminal case. It's also possible that you think that there is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but the government decides in its discretion not to bring a case. That happens also all the time. And the irony here is, this is the incoming Trump administration, which didn't seem to have the same standard when they were accusing Hillary Clinton of simply emails and saying she should be locked up. And that's a case where the department also declined. So they're really applying very, very different standards here in terms of how they're looking at this, depending on whether they like or dislike the person involved.
Okay, thank you for the technical clarification there, which I think everybody needs to understand. I want to go back to just what you had mentioned and what I started the show with, because what I'm trying to get to the root at during this show is the sheer responsibility of these jobs and the competence factor. And Speaker Johnson called Matt Gaetz, I don't know if you saw this, but he called him one of the brightest minds in Washington, or anywhere for that matter, which I'm betting you don't agree with. But talk to me a little bit about, and to our audience most importantly, about what are the sheer responsibilities of the Attorney General, and how, if you can, does that role impact people's actual lives?
So, it's easy in the abstract to say, I'm anti-government, I'm anti-bureaucracy, but let's just focus on what the Department of Justice does for people. On a criminal side, people can be victims of fraud. There's public corruption. There's unscrupulous executives. There are people who are polluters. There are all sorts of ways in which criminal cases are brought where American people are victimized. But more than that, the thing that I am really sort of laser focused on is that you need somebody who is going to really be able to read the Presidential Daily Brief, the PDB, which has enormous amounts of information about threat streams involving terrorist activity in this country that affects people and can cause massive destruction of property and loss of lives. And what is critical, and what I've seen firsthand, is you want somebody who is going to do the work and is able to do triage and separate the noise from what are the real threats out there. I have seen people with enormous experience engage in that task. This is not a time to learn on the job. And that really goes to our fundamental safety. I mean, to me, that is why the things that you're talking about here in terms of the Attorney General, the DNI, the DOD, those are critical positions for the American safety.
No question. Thank you for explaining that so clearly. I think people sometimes get wrapped up in the bureaucratic aspect of it. It's much bigger than that. Thank you, Andrew Weissmann, as always.
Joining me now, Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney, now law professor at the University of Alabama, MSNBC legal analyst and host of the Sisters in Law podcast, and Ryan Riley, NBC News justice reporter and author of the book Sedition Hunters, How January 6th Broke the Justice System. So as I welcome you both, Joyce, even if everyone at DOJ is not on board with these so-called revenge prosecutions, can an Attorney General Gaetz, can he still make it happen?
So attorney generals can set priorities. And certainly the top tier of DOJ appointees, people who hold the assistant attorney general level, those will be folks that Donald Trump has selected. The problem is that to do a prosecution, you need line prosecutors, people who know how to get into the courtroom and do a case. And even if you can find folks like that who are willing to abandon principle, you still have to convince a grand jury to indict, a trial jury to convict, a judge to go along with it. And so, Alex, much like what we've seen in the area of these threatened military prosecutions last night over Afghanistan, again, this is less a goal of engaging in legitimate prosecutions and more an effort to threaten people, to force them into alignment with Donald Trump, to demand their allegiance and their obedience in advance. We should identify it for what it is. This is not any form of legitimate investigation or prosecution.
But hang on, would there be a problem, Joyce, right from the very get-go? Because can they even be prosecuted based on the Supreme Court ruling that the president, right, the president enjoys immunity for official acts? Does it stand to reason then that immunity would extend to all federal officers making official decisions in various government agencies at the direction of the president?
So, look, there's no derivative immunity that's yet been established based on the presidential immunity decision. Some people suspect that that may be coming, that people may say, well, because I was speaking with the president about official government business, I too am entitled to immunity. We haven't seen that yet. And, you know, it would, I think, be, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves and see consequences that would impact other conduct. We want prosecutors to live up to the Justice Department's ethical standards, to follow the rule of law, to obey their oath to the Constitution, and not to rely on this sort of off-brand immunity.
Yeah, point well taken there. So, Ryan, when it comes to the January 6th rioters, what are your sources anticipating for those whose cases are still pending?
Yeah, what's so interesting is that in some ways, a lot of the January 6th supporters in that community are on the same page as DOJ lawyers about what Matt Gaetz would mean for the Justice Department. You know, I had one wife of the first January 6th defendant to go to trial describe him as a wrecking ball. Of course, she meant that in a good way, whereas DOJ employees, I don't think, are on the same page necessarily with that being good. So they are shared in this idea that Matt Gaetz would be a really disruptive force if he were to be confirmed. But certainly, you know, if you're looking at these next 60 plus days, how long we have until President Trump is inaugurated, what the sleuths, at least the online sleuths, are trying to do is get as many of these assault on law enforcement cases over the line as they possibly can, and pushing the FBI to do as many of those as they can. Because right now, if you went to the FBI's website and looked at their Capitol violence page, you would see more than 70 people who are pictured on that site, who have already been identified, whose names are in the hands of the FBI. So if you're worried about what, you know, this could mean for the future going forward, they want to get as many of those arrested as they can before that, because that at least creates a record of what these folks did, regardless of whether or not Donald Trump decides to pardon them or dismiss these cases, or orders his Justice Department folks
let
to
me pick up on the pardons, Ryan, because after Trump promised on the campaign trail to issue blanket pardons to rioters, a campaign spokesperson told you President Trump will make pardon decisions on a case-by-case basis. What's going on there?
Yeah, I was surprised that they stuck with that language, right? Because now we're post-election. April, when I talked to them back in April, they said sort of the same thing, and they're still going by case. But remember, that's his campaign team. That's the transition team now. That's not Donald Trump himself. And so there's often a divide between what, you know, sort of the, I guess, adults in the room are trying to do and what Donald Trump ultimately decides to do. So that is still, I think, a very much sort of thing that's up in the air about whether or not they're actually going to do these sort of blanket pardons or not.
Okay. Joyce, CNN reports Trump's transition team is skipping FBI checks for some of his administration picks, adding they believe the FBI system is slow and the intrusive background checks sometimes turn up embarrassing information used to inflict political damage. Why is this problematic, and how many do you think might have difficulty getting security clearances?
Right. So I think that's the point, Alex. The fear that these background investigations could turn up let's say, embarrassing, I might say disqualifying information. We've already seen that Trump's team has not done a great job of vetting some of their candidates. The nominee for defense, it has already come to light that he had paid a woman who alleged that he sexually assaulted her. He denies that and said that he paid her a nuisance settlement, but apparently that wasn't known by the transition team or by Trump before he was nominated. So that suggests, I think, a very sloppy process for these important level of positions. Look, there's only one reason that you back away from this normal background security clearance procedure, and that's because you think your nominees can't clear the hurdle. And to the extent that some clearances take a longer time, that can be the case when people have problematic backgrounds, when they're born overseas. But let me tell you something. When the administration has a nominee who's they want to get in office, they're able to get the FBI to turn that around incredibly quickly. So it's nonsense to say that that's the reason it's not being done.
Okay. Joyce Vance, Ryan Riley. Always good to talk with you both. Thank you, guys. Right now is former Republican Congressman Denver Riggleman. I'm going to get to that, but first I want to ask you about the breaking news regarding the Biden administration allowing Ukraine now to use long-range U.S. missiles to strike into Russia. What is your reaction to that?
Well done. I was just in Ukraine. I got back last month. Alex, I probably should have told you, some other time. But yeah, I was just in Ukraine, and I think this is a fantastic opportunity and a fantastic decision to project power against Russia. And I think it's a fantastic decision. It's hard for me, to go into all the variables right in that decision making. But in these last 2 months before Donald Trump is inaugurated, I think it's this time right now that we need to make sure that Russia understands what that pushback is as they're trying to make way and take more territory in Ukraine.
Okay, well, so you were in Ukraine. Give me a sense of what the feeling is about the war right now and where it stands. How badly do Ukrainians want it to end? How do they want it to end? When do they want it to end? I mean, what are the circumstances around